Hey everyone, welcome back to another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. Happy to be back again, talking some more Canadian military history. And this one today, especially if you follow me on social media, I've been doing some Air Force stuff and getting a little trouble for it on Twitter, which is fun in its own right. But so it's going to be good to talk about an RCAF topic, an area that a lot of you know I've been doing a lot with lately, different things. So we're going to be looking at a specific bomber squadron from the Second World War. Some of you have probably seen the presentation on World War II TV. We're going to be doing a little bit of the same, so there'll be a little bit of similar things going on, but we're going to look at some other stuff and kind of dig into a few different issues, as me and Greg were talking about. And today's guest, Greg Kopchuk, excited to have him on. He was just showing me the book. He's done a ton of work on the squadron today that we're going to be looking at. But I won't steal any more of his thunder. I'll let him go, and this should be a really, really good one. So I'm really excited to finally get Greg on the channel. So thanks for coming on, Greg. Sorry about the whole delay before, and I had some family. We had a death in the family, unfortunately, when you were supposed to come on, and it was a whole.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, that's okay. So yeah, sorry we couldn't schedule earlier. As I was just telling you, work's been crazy basically ever since the new year started. So I'm glad we can do this.
No problem. Thank you.
Really excited to have you on. And again, talking about this project. So you kind of go into it, but I always like to ask, particularly when someone's been on the channel for the first time, just how did you get here? Like, and I know you're going to be telling about this, but like, how did you discover this story is probably the best way to
well, I didn't start out to do a history of 429 Squadron in World War II. I started out trying to find out what happened to my uncle.
Right.
And he was Flight Sergeant John Kopchuk, and he was killed on June 22nd, 1943. And the family basically didn't know anything about him. And so I started to research what happened to him. And that took about 12 years. And of course, it turns out he served on 429 Squadron. So I started focusing in, interviewing vets from 429, and before you know it, I had all this material for a book. And for some crazy reason, I decided to write a book. But it's kind of like having kids. If you know how much work it is, you'd never do it.
Yeah, after doing a dissertation, I got to agree with the difficulty and the crazy moniker. It's a lot of work, but it's rewarding. And again, seeing your show on World War II TV, I know what you put into this, and we've talked for a while now. So, yeah. And speaking of the book, actually, I will pull up. So you have controls are yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And of course, people can ask questions as we go, and see what we can do and interject as well. If I'm going way off topic, that sort of thing. This is my book. It's available on Amazon in Kindle form or print on demand. And this was the original hard copy version that is special edition, numbered, autographed by the author. But one of the interesting things we did was did a contest online to see which photos should be on the cover. And you can see on volume 2, it's actually the whole squadron in March of 1945. And they're all over this Lancaster bomber. Now, the one thing about 429 Squadron, they didn't get Lancs until March of 45. Yeah. And of course, the war ended, in April, basically.
Pretty much.
So they only had the Lancs for about 6 weeks. Yeah. And the majority of the time, when they were first formed in November of 42 until August of 43, they flew Wellingtons. And then from August 43 till March 45, they flew Halifaxes. Yeah. So, it seemed much more appropriate that it would be a Halifax bomber on the cover. So volume 1, that cover photo actually placed in second place with votes online of which is the best one to use. But so I overrode it. And plus Carl from the Bomber Command Museum called me up numerous times and said, here's why you have to put a Halley on the cover, Greg.
I mean, I think I got to agree based on just everything I know about the squadron and all the work you've done. I mean, it's a great picture. I used it in the thumbnail, obviously, because I had access to it. But it's a great photo, but it's you gotta rep that plane. I think the Langs get a lot of attention, and the Halifaxes need a little more, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, they're restoring one down at the Bomber Command Museum in Nanton. There's already one in Trenton. So, we finally get to see what a Halifax bomber looks like. I mean, I didn't know Halifax bombers existed until I was about, I don't know, around 18, 19. And I go, what's a Halifax? Right? So,
all right. But it is what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So this book, like I said, it's 79 years in the making. It resulted in my uncle, John Kopchuk, dying on 22nd June of 43. And when we actually did the book launch was last August at the Bomber Command Museum in Nanton. Dave Burrell and Carl did a fabulous job arranging that. And this is a picture of my uncle. He was an observer, actually trained as a navigator. And oddly enough, he did all his training in Edmonton. He did his Manning Depot in Edmonton. Really? He did his ITS in Edmonton. Wow. And he did his Air Observer School in Edmonton. Now, which is almost unheard of.
Yeah, that's weird. Yeah.
If you ever follow any Air Force person that was trained during the war for aircrew, Manning Depot was usually done somewhere, ITS somewhere else, and their trade training in a third location, right?
Yep.
So this was highly unusual that it ended up that way. And we didn't really know a lot about my uncle, right? He was buried in Vlissingen. That much we knew. And there was a family by the surname of Tran who started taking care of his grave right at the end of the war. And that's the initial ones there with the dogs. That's Nellie on the left and Kaz on the right. They started taking care of his grave. And then now their kids and their next kids and the kids after that, we have 4 generations of the Tran family that has been taking care of my uncle's grave in Vlissingen. And when I look at it to my children, it's 4 generations from, when John was born to my grandparents. And we have these 4 generations of families from 2 sides of the ocean that are joined as a result of John's death and the entire crew. Yeah. Yes, I've been to Vlissingen 3 times. My parents have been there twice, and we're like family to each other. They call my parents aunt and uncle. I used to call Nellie Baba in Holland. If you're Ukrainian, that stands for grandma. Yeah. So it all started basically in 1979. I wrote the archives to say, hey, I'd like to find out more information about my uncle. Because we didn't know anything. Didn't know what squadron he served on. All we knew is the day he died and where he was buried. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I'd like to find out what happened. And so off I went on my quest. Now, just to let everyone know, in 1979, I was 18. Okay, so I've been at this a while. All right.
Just a bit.
Yeah. And so, of course, the first thing, there were 2 tidbits of information that came back in the 1-page letter that the archive sent. One was that he was posted to 429 Squadron in 14th of May of 43, and that he had been shot down and killed on an op to Krefeld, Germany, which was launched on 22 June 1943. Mm-hmm. So we have a little bit of information. And then I eventually wrote and got his complete personnel file, but that was 10, 15 years down the road. And I kind of left it at that. And then eventually I found out about an interesting document called an ORB, an operational records book. Each squadron kept one. It's kind of like a diary. Yep. And then I thought, wow, I can get one of those. And I wrote the archives, got a copy. And I thought, boy, I can find out more about my uncle. Well, what did I find out? Not much. They flew one op to Wuppertal on the 29th of May, and Krefeld was their second op. The crew, you can see them all standing there. The night they were shot down, 429 Squadron lost 4 other crews that night. That's the most number of crews they lost on one op in the entire war. The next day, they went to Mannheim. They lost 2 more crews. So basically, in a 24-hour period, they lost 6 crews. And they lost 10 crews in total in June of 43 out of like 31 crews.
Wow.
So, is quite a number of, the squadron was just being shot out of the sky, basically.
Yeah.
Is what it ended up being. I also eventually found out that thanks to Theo Boughton and Michael Blaze, that the man who shot down my uncle's plane was Major Kurt Holler. And he was also shot down and killed that night as well, about 20 minutes later. And his radar operator, Robert Gotha, jumped to safety and survived the war. And I didn't get to Robert Gotha before he died. He was actually on his deathbed. And I had made the acquaintance of Peter Spoden, another German night fighter pilot. And he traveled to their home to see if he could talk to Robert Gotha. And of course, he was unconscious and in the hospital. And his wife gave him a picture of Major Holler, but wouldn't give him a picture of Robert. So I don't know what Robert Gotha ever looked like, unfortunately. And that's a picture of me visiting Kurt Holler's grave in Holland. There's a big cemetery for all the German war vets that were killed there as well.
If you don't mind, Greg, real quick, because Great Dominion is a good supporter of the channel. Milk runs, right? Like practice runs, right? You mentioned they were on their second op. So I just want to ask, is that what it was? They were just kind of thrown into the fray. Was there kind of any reason why that was? Because I hear a lot of stories, right, of exactly that. They get the easy ones. They get the drop in the the mines in the water in the North Sea, that kind of thing. But this one, it doesn't sound like it.
Well, no. As a matter of fact, the pilot Ernest Starr only did 1 second dicky trip. Normally, you're supposed to do 2 before they send you out. And they send you on a whole bunch of bullseye exercises, which is simulating a bomb op where you're bombing a target with dummy bombs in England. During this time period, they were going through crews so badly that they were just essentially throwing them in with minimal training. I mean, when you start going into 1944 and mid 44, a crew is on the squadron for 2-3 months before they fly a bombing op, right?
Yeah.
So, it's the average time a Wellington crew lasted on 429 Squadron was 7 ops.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
So it wasn't very long. These are pictures of all the graves of the crew. There's actually 4 members of the crew that are buried in Vlissingen. One is buried as an unknown, because it turns out when the MRES or MRUS, whichever acronym, went to dig everyone up at the end of the war to identify all the Air Force veterans, they couldn't locate the head on the 4th body. And so they couldn't positively identify him, because he appeared to be about 5'10", 5'11", light or dark brown hair. And guess what? Ernest Starr and William George Parkinson, the tail gunner, were both 5'10" and 5'11", and they both have brown hair. And the 5th body was never recovered. It went down with the plane. And I think the 5th person in the plane was probably Ernest Starr, the pilot, just based on all the information I gathered.
Right.
And also there is a picture of Lake Kopchuk in northern Saskatchewan. At the end of World War II, all the province were supposed to name various land features after fallen veterans of World War II. Saskatchewan was the only province that actually completed the project.
Mm-hmm.
And in my research and us doing this, it was my sister who found out that there's a Lake Kopchuk in northern Saskatchewan. My father didn't even know.
Wow.
So, you know, maybe the family was notified that this was done. Maybe they weren't.
Yeah, because I've done a little bit of work on that myself, actually, and I'm probably want to talk to you about that after. But as far as I know, not really. But like the things you mentioned earlier, right? Like they were told date of death, usually location of burial, and that kind of stuff. So anything like this, as far as I know, wasn't really communicated to the family in a direct way. Especially much later. Yeah.
And as I understand it, Manitoba was the only other province to come close to completing it. They apparently are about 70% complete.
Yeah, Manitoba's got quite a few. BC's got a little bit. Ontario a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so what are you going to find in the book? Basically, what I wanted to do was document the death of every single member of the squadron. And also include in it the roll of honor. The first time I called 429 Squadron, which is still active in Trenton, I called them in like 1999. I asked them if they had a roll of honor of everyone who served on the squadron, and they said no. So I thought, well, that's the first thing that needs to be created here is a roll of honor. Every op the squadron flew is documented and listed. Every CO that took over the squadron and acting COs is documented. And I also went on a quest to dig up a photo of every single one of them.
Wow.
Every decoration awarded on the squadron is also documented.
Wow.
Their original citations. And every aircraft on the squadron is documented. That's not something I set out to do, but in the end, you go, wow, look at all this information. So
yeah, I get that. That's let me jump in there, Greg. That's from what I knowing what I do. Documenting just photos that's impressive to do that. That's very impressive.
All right. Well, thank you. And of course, every battle honor is documented, and I got the official descriptions of the battle honors, from DHIST and in Ottawa.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in trying to find out what happened to my uncle, I talked to a lot of veterans, collected a lot of information and their stories, which of course I ended up putting in the book as well to add the human element. And I like photos, so there's like 630 photos in the book.
That's amazing. Hey, that sounds good to me. Yeah, that sounds awesome.
And 730 pages. And if you look at the print on demand version of the book, you can see it's really thick. So I call it the 429 Encyclopedia series.
Might as well be.
It puts a bend in my bookcase.
And nothing wrong with that.
It's about 3 pounds.
Yeah.
Now, basically, when I was putting together the roll of honor, eventually it ended up there were 395 names of air crew on the roll of honor. 17 air crew, like I said, were killed on 22 June of 43 on the op to Krefeld. 3 became POWs out of the 4 crews shot down. And in total, there was 1 Royal Australian Air Force air crew that was killed, 1 New Zealander, 1 United States Army Air Force personnel, and 127 RAF personnel, and of course 265 Canadians killed on the squadron. Now, in those 265 Canadians, there's a whole bunch of Americans.
Yes.
In there as well. Yeah. And they had not yet transferred to the United States Army Air Force before they were killed.
Right. So, yeah, well, if you mind, real quick, just that 1 Army Air Force's casualty, because that's my question, is because there's sons of Americans serving in the RCAF throughout the entire war. Was it an observer? Do you know what was going on there?
I think it was a tail gunner. It was Mick Roberts was his name. And, what happened was once America came into the war,
right.
those that were in the RCAF or RAF were allowed to transfer into the American Air Force, and then they got issued, American service numbers. They wore American uniforms and that sort of thing. And initially, early on, even in 1943, for some reason, they were really slow to get guys transferred back in.
Mm.
And that actually happened with several guys. You can see, in their files, they were writing saying, well, when can I get transferred to the American Air Force? Because I want that $10,000 insurance, for my wife if I'm killed. And lo and behold, they got shot down and killed, and they were still in the Royal Canadian Air Force, right? So, yeah, I'm not sure why they were so slow to get them moved in, but yeah,
it's interesting though. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Before I forget, someone is an admirer of your shirt. If you wanted to talk about that real quick.
Oh,
Bruce likes the shirt. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I just got this from the Bomber Command Museum in Nanton. It's a tribute to the 429 Squadron Halifax LV 993 ALM, M for mother. Flew the most ops of any Halifax bomber in 6th group with 95, and maybe the only Halifax in all of Bomber Command with that many ops.
Yeah.
And we'll actually be talking about it a little further on in my presentation. So,
yeah. I just didn't want to lose that one.
Yeah. Yeah, no problem. It's my birthday present to myself. I bought this.
Nice.
All right. So where are we at now? Let's get this going. Okay. Now, so I just kind of want to show you, you were talking about, were they kind of thrown into things? Well, the Wellington period was from November 42 to August 43. Now, they didn't fly their first operational mission until January 21, and it was a mining op. Okay. And 4 crews went out and they lost 1 crew. So you're talking January to August, 8 months flying ops. They did 59 ops on Wellingtons, and the average time a crew would last was 7 ops. And a lot of people were also coming in and being transferred out. Like when they were forming the squadrons and, for North Africa, you'd see guys in the squadron for 1, 2 ops and they're gone, 3 ops, they're gone, that kind of thing. So 36 aircraft were lost in total during that time, 119 aircrew killed. Now, no Wellington made it to 30 ops in the squadron. 2 made 19 ops. Okay. So now compared to the Halifax period, which was August 43 to March of 45, they flew 209 ops on Halleys.
Mm-hmm.
They lost 65. So they lost about twice as many as the Wellingtons, right? And they flew 3 times as many missions, but 177 aircrew killed. And 28 Halifax bombers made it to 30 ops or more on the squadron. Okay. That's just in 429 squadron. I don't know how it compares to other squadrons, but there were a lot of teething growing pains of the squadron to start. And, when I started looking at it, actually, according to one book I read, 429 Squadron has the distinction of suffering the most Wellington bomber losses in 6th group.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I don't know if they included the time prior to 6th group when they were in 4 group while they were being formed, because they didn't go to 6th group until 1 April of 43.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, something a little unique that 6th group did that none of the other groups did is they handed out a target token, and that was for any bomb aimer who hit the actual aiming point. So the intelligence section would be able to assess it, and then they'd have a parade, hand this out. A copy went to every member of the crew, and they usually got 3 days leave with it as well, and sometimes a bottle of whiskey. Nice. And that sort of thing. So this is an example of a 429 op where they, the crew hit the aiming point and then off they went for 3 days leave. So. And none of the other groups did anything like that, which is kind of interesting. I don't know why the Canadians thought about it, but maybe they wanted to get that accuracy.
I honestly couldn't tell you. I've heard like nothing like this. Just similar things, but nothing quite this intensive, if that's the right word. But yeah, I've heard like other things, but nothing quite like leave or a commemoration in this sense. It's something I think that is quite unique.
Right. Okay, so one of the this is a bone of contention about why is the squadron the way it is. The first CO posted to 429 Squadron was Wing Commander Owen, RAF type, career RAF type. And apparently at the time he was made a wing commander. He was the youngest wing commander in the RAF. He was in his 30s. Now, he didn't fly any bombing ops while he was on 429 Squadron. He was posted in with a crew. He did 4 second dicky trips, and I've listed them there. The interesting thing here is the Lancaster had a second dicky Barini on his trip on the 28th of February as well. Because at first I thought Owen was checking out all these pilots to make sure they're good to start flying second dicky ops.
Right.
But on the 28th of February, Lancaster flew a second dicky op. Usually you had to be a senior crew with like 15 ops or more. And most of these guys are sitting around 10 ops. They're being checked out to fly second dicky operations on the squadron. As a matter of fact, all our second dicky trips were done with 76 and 78 Squadron, which were down the road. Okay. And we would travel down to them and hook up with them and do the second dicky ops there. Our last second dicky op was with 78 Squadron on the 26th of March, which is quite late into the squadron's history. So, you're kind of looking at this and saying, well, what's going on? What's happened? Why is it taking so long for 429 Squadron to get up to snuff, and that they're fully trained and flying their own second dicky ops and doing everything else? And I don't know if it had anything to do with the CO or not. Like I said, he didn't fly any ops at all. He, one of his sons told me he flew bombing ops in France. I took a look at his movement papers that he sent me. He was not posted to an actual squadron in France. He was posted to a headquarters area. And he also said, well, he flew with Bomber Harris on 51 Squadron in Iraq in the 30s. And I looked, and he was not ever posted to a squadron. So why they picked him is, I'm not sure. His son defended him by saying, well, he did really good in training command. He was exceptional with training people. But to put a guy with no operational experience into an operational bomber squadron, I'm still scratching my head at that one. I can't figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, all I could say would be a guess. I mean, maybe it was the training element, because I have heard that before with other commands. So,
yeah,
it's the best guess.
Yeah, and when I took a look at it, I took a look at 427, 428 Squadron, who were all formed on 7 November of 42 as well with 429. And then 431 was also formed on November 11th of 42. And I took a look, okay, who were their COs? So when you look at it, they all had RAF COs posted in as the first CO.
Right.
Now, on 427 Squadron, they took a nucleus of 10 crews from 419 to form the squadron on 427. Burnside was in there on the very first day. They flew a training op on the first day. They actually flew operations in December of 42. And Burnside himself flew 15 ops while he was on 427 squadron. Now on 428 squadron, the squadron flew 10 ops during the time Earl was there, but he didn't fly any ops either. And he was posted out on the 18th of February of 43.
Okay.
After the squadron being formed in November.
Right.
Now, the second CO who was promoted, Wing Commander Smith, at the formation of the squadron, he was actually posted in as one of the flight commanders. And then he got promoted to CO.
Right.
And he was a Canadian.
Oh, okay.
And he was flying ops the whole time, right from when the squadron started. Now, 431 squadron had the same teething problems as 429. They were waiting on aircraft for the longest time. They got clapped out old Wellington Mark IIIs. Crew trickled in off and on, for quite a while.
Right.
The squadron finally flew their first op on March 2nd of 43. So they were very late getting up to speed. And their CO, Cloverdale, flew 4 ops with the squadron, and he was shot down and killed on the op to Krefeld in June of 43 as well. So you can see 2 of the 3 squadrons had flying, fighting COs, and 428 had a fighting CO fairly quickly on in February of 43. Okay. Now, one of the big issues was, as the squadrons twice a month, they had to post a memo up to 6 groups saying how many Canadians, what percentage of the squadron was Canadians. Now, so this was interesting when you look at these are 429 stats. The first thing that happens when the squadron is formed is a whole bunch of RAF types are posted in.
Yeah.
Now, when you look at it, I mean, Bomber Command, 65, 70% of Bomber Command was RAF types, right? And RAF VRs. So they just posted everyone as they came along, and it didn't matter. They didn't single out people saying, oh, you're a Canadian, you must go to this Canadian squadron, right?
Yep.
So, it took until like April of 45 before 90% of the squadron was Canadian.
Yeah.
It took quite a while. And one of the main reasons was almost all the flight engineers were RAF types.
Right. Yeah. Yeah,
So,
which makes perfect sense. I mean, given the timing, and I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but like the politics of it all, and those inside of the group, those with inside the bombers, right, had to say in some of this stuff. So I think that plays a huge role. I think not necessarily gets forgotten, but the camaraderie, the camaraderie that develops between these guys isn't something they just wanted to undo based on a political decision, right? So
and like when each tour was each crew was done, and they got posted away, and eventually all the Canadians go home, and a member of their crew is in England, the flight engineer, more than likely, right? So there was always this distance between them even after the war, because a lot of the crews would get together, but of course their flight engineer, he's in England, Now, there were a few Canadian flight engineers that were on the squadron as well.
Oh, okay.
And I think it was quite later when they actually started training flight engineers in Canada.
Yeah,
and shipping them over.
Really late. Yeah.
Yeah, what they did in England is they would recruit any of the aero engine or airframe mechanics that were working on planes and saying, "Hey, do you want to go fly ops?" Right. And see, part of the problem was a lot of the guys that were ground crew, they weren't medically fit to fly as air crew.
Right.
As a matter of fact, there's 3 Canadians that became flight engineers, led by Eric Stouffer, who they were all medically unfit for air crew, and they went and tried to become flight engineers anyway, and their medical records hadn't caught up with them from Canada. And so they went through and said, yeah, they had their medicals and all this other stuff. And, they got their flight engineer brevet and flew ops, completed their tours before anyone figured out they were all medically unfit. And Eric Stouffer himself was colorblind. So he always wondered, is this going to cause a problem for me?
Yeah.
What's the color of the day of the flare I have to shoot?
Yeah, that could have been real bad real fast.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, the interesting thing here is Eastmoor that's where 429 Squadron was stationed, Eastmoor.
Yeah.
Became an RAF station around, I don't know, March, April. And they show a picture here. That's Wing Commander Owen in the middle. And they're raising the RCAF ensign to celebrate, the starting of 6th Group, which happened on January 1st of 43. Mm-hmm. And that's the caption for this picture actually says, that's why they're raising the ensign, because the formation is 6th Group, but 429 Squadron was not in 6th Group on January 1st of 43. Right. They didn't get there till April. Yeah. And so, it's interesting. The date of the photo is 3 February 43. So it's hard to know if that's the date it was taken or the date the picture was developed. And it depends what date they record, because exactly. I've seen where the dates of photos do not match the incident they're describing at all.
Happens all the time.
Yes.
Yeah, it's rather unfortunate, but I see it constantly. I'm like, that doesn't make sense. So it's got to be the development date. Sometimes both are recorded. It's an unfortunate part of the historical record, but there's not much we can do about it now, unfortunately.
Exactly.
I see it all the time. It drives me crazy, but yeah.
Yeah. I one of the questions I eventually, was trying to figure out how to answer is, why was 429 didn't move to 6th Group until the 1st April of 43? April Fools, actually. When you look at the formation of these squadrons, all of them, except 429 and 431, moved on January 1st to 6th Group. And it's like 431 was late, not till July, and 429 went in April. And so I was trying to find an answer to this, and I was looking at Spencer Dunsmore's doctor's dissertation on 6th Group. There was another fellow in Calgary who did his doctorate on 6th Group, or master's, I believe. And I actually spoke to the prof who supervised them, saying, can you shed any light on why 429 moves so late? Because it's documented in a lot of places. Wing Commander Air Vice Marshal Carr, who was in charge of 4 Group, he saw a lot of problems with 431 Squadron, and he did not want to hand it over to 6th Group until he felt they were properly trained. And so it took them a while. I mean, they didn't start flying ops until March of 43, right? Quite a while after everyone else.
Right.
So the only educated guess I can make is he didn't feel 429 was up to snuff yet and properly trained, because in late March, we're still doing our second Dickey ops with 76 and 78 Squadron.
Right.
So until the unit is self-contained and can train its own people internally, and it has to rely on other people, Carr didn't feel, 6th Group should have the burden of trying to get the squadron up to snuff when they were trying to get organized as a group.
Right. Which makes sense.
because there were a lot of teething pains with the group.
Oh yeah.
Now, of course, the two people that were most opposed to 6th Group being formed were Carr and Bomber Harris.
I wonder why.
Yeah, because the majority of these squadrons were actually all in 4 Group.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So did that have something to do with it? I don't think that political aspect did as much as the fact that 429 Squadron wasn't quite up to snuff yet, and 431 took a lot longer.
Like normally you'd say, it's the political, but because Harris was overruled for 6th Group period, I can't see 2 squadrons being some sort of victory for him holding on to them,
Yeah, it wouldn't make sense. And of course, everyone's like, why did 6th Group get formed? Right? Because what we had was when we established the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan in Canada, Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister at the time, negotiated a clause that said we could create our own independent Air Force from the RAF.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, one of the sticking points before, I guess somehow Harris was involved, and he finally said when 6th Group was ready to go, one of the big things was 6th Group wanted Lanks, Lancaster bombers.
Yeah.
And then finally, Harris responded, the Canadian squadrons can have all the Lancasters that Canada builds.
Of course he would say that.
Okay. So that, finally there is agreement. Okay, 6th Group. Fine. And of course, a lot of the squadrons got Lanks quite late.
Oh, yeah.
And none of them were the Mark 10 Lanks that were built in Canada, by the way.
No,
not a single one made it to 429 Squadron.
Yeah, none of them were in RCAF until after the war. I had a few, but not until after the war had ended.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about another interesting aspect of the squadron. It was the squadron crest.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the saga of the squadron crest goes on for several years.
Yeah.
In 429 Squadron. This eventually was the crest. And of course, the man in charge of designing, assisting, and helping get approved squadron crest was J.D. Heaton Armstrong. He's pictured here on the right. His family sent me this photo. It's and cool. So what happened was originally Wing Commander Owen submitted a draft of a crest in January of 43 to Heaton, and what he did was he put his own family crest into it. Now, I don't have a copy of what the design looked like, but I searched on the internet to find the Owen family crest.
Yeah.
And what happened was Heaton replied back saying, it's not appropriate. That hasn't been done since the time of Oliver Cromwell. Okay. So he kind of gets put in his place.
Yeah, rightfully so. I mean, I'm not the one to usually, bang the drum, but I mean, that's a little ridiculous.
Well, and it's quite interesting. I'll talk about it later, but none of the vets that were on the squadron at the time can remember Wing Commander Owen asking for input from anyone on the squadron. What should be on the squadron crest?
Right.
Okay. So actually, Heaton writes back and says, well, since you've been adopted by the city of Bradford, which was in January of 43 in Yorkshire, why don't you incorporate something from their crest and coat of arms?
Right.
And, on the right, you can see the mace that the Lord Mayor would wear.
Yep.
And on the left is kind of a drawing of what it looks like, as well as the coat of arms of the city of Bradford. And so what they decided on was, why not use the boar's head? And right here, This is in January of 43 when the squadron was adopted by Bradford, the city of Bradford. You can see the Lord Mayor is wearing the mace with the crest on there. And on the right is Padre Lowry, who was a well-respected Protestant Padre of the squadron by all members of the squadron. They just loved the guy. Mm-hmm. And on the left, of course, is Wing Commander Owen. And they're shaking hands with the mayor. And it's interesting, that mace ended up getting robbed and stolen in, I think it was about 1946. Oh. It was never recovered. Oh. And they had to make a new one. So that is the original one that was made in like the 1890s, and then it disappeared, never to be recovered again.
Weird.
Yeah. So eventually, with a flurry of emails, Owen and Heaton agree on using the boar's head and a bunch of maple leaves to signify it's Canada. Mm. And actually, I don't know where Owen got the idea or if someone told him, but the motto, which means nothing to chance in Latin, is Fortune Nihil. Kind of sounds like 429.
Yeah, kind of.
So it must have been someone on the squadron that knew Latin that suggested it. Okay. Yeah. So they submitted that as the motto, and it actually stuck. That part which Owen submitted stuck. So on the 16th of March, Owen says, yeah, this looks good. Heaton says, okay, we're going to submit it for approval. And it has to go back to Canada, approved by the Governor General. Then it comes back to England, and then it gets signed by the King, mm-hmm. King George, at the time. So nothing happens. Everything's all quiet on the 429 front until October 2nd of 43, and these two men will have a pivotal role in changing the squadron crest. Okay. On the left is Flight Lieutenant Higgins, and he's the squadron adjutant. He's the one that runs with the ball administratively from this time until it finally gets presented to the squadron in April of 45. And on the right is Wing Commander Pattison. He's the third CO of the fourth CO of the squadron by this point. And, he must have gotten a memo that said, oh, it's been approved in Canada and it just has to go to King George now.
Yeah.
And he sends a memo back to Heaton saying, wait a minute. This does not represent Canada. Can we get this changed? Is it too late? Can we stop the process? and Heaton writes back and says, yeah, sure. But of course it's going to take longer and you're going to have to go at the back of the queue if you do. So what Pattison does is he asks the squadron, okay, everyone, we need a squadron crest. Put some ideas together. We'll put them all together. And on October 26th of 43 in hangar number 2, where they're at Leeming now because they moved there in August of 43 when they switched to Halley's, all the squadron comes in and has a vote of which one they like the most. Now, one of the proposals had a beaver on it. Now, can you imagine in this day and age being called the Beaver Squadron?
Yeah, that would be real bad.
Yeah, but back then it didn't, right? Because the Air Force Club in London was actually called the Beaver Club.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. Was it just for the Air Force or all branches of the service?
Oh, that's a good question.
I think it was all branches.
I think you're right. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. It was called the Beaver Club too, right?
Yeah.
So this was one of the proposals, but eventually the Bison wins out.
Mm-hmm.
So then October 26th, Pattison fires off a memo to Heaton and says, yep, the Bison is, the one everyone wants. We like this. And they start going back and forth more about the design. And one of the biggest problems was they didn't have a picture of a Bison to give Heaton, and And one of the guys on the squadron had a radiator cap with a cast version of a Bison.
Oh, okay.
And they took it off. They took it off his car, and they sent it to Heaton along with a what they called the American Indian nickel, which had a Bison on one side.
The buffalo nickel, yeah.
Yeah, and a Native American on the front of it.
Yeah.
Now, so of course, now at this point, you can tell Patterson really wants to make his mark on the squadron. And he's doing it. He's flying ops, right? And the only time he flies ops is to Germany. Targets in Germany. That's it. No other times. But he's up front leading all the time. He, whenever he asks his men to do something, he's right up front doing it. For a while there, he thought the air crew were out of shape, so he'd take them on jogs around the airfield, to try and get them in shape, And he even experimented with underbelly turrets on the Halifax. Right. They tore out the H2S and they put in a 30 caliber machine gun, laid down a mattress, and put an eighth guy in the Hali, right? Is an underbelly gunner, and you can see it in the ORB. And it turns out they're the only ones that ever experimented with this. It wasn't an actual turret. They put a mattress down, and I talked to one guy who did it, Ernie Nelson. He flew an op, and he was the underbelly turret. And I said, how'd you stay awake when you're lying on a mattress, right?
In the dark.
Yeah. And I said, could you see anything? Because I remember, what was it, Pendleton's book, A Thousand Shall Fall, when they got the B-17s and 217 Squadron. And he said they didn't use the underbelly turret because they couldn't see anything.
Yeah.
So I asked him, how did it work? He said it was great. Huh. So I thought, wow, there's a bit of a contradiction.
Yeah.
So anyway, so we're moving along trying to get the Bison approved as the new squadron crest. And lo and behold, there's this one official photo here. It was taken sometime in October or November of 43. I'm guessing probably more November. And on the left is Del Kenny, who was the squadron leader, and he eventually became the acting CEO for a while. And a visitor there, Flight Lieutenant Rains. And behind him is a water buffalo head. Yep. Okay, so they don't have any Bison heads anywhere, so somehow Patterson got a hold of a water buffalo head, throws it up on the wall to try and get everyone going. And he even asked Heaton, can we call ourselves, the Buffalo Squadron? And Heaton comes back, well, no, there's another Canadian squadron also known as the Buffalo Squadron, and they agree, wow, we can use the word Bison. Because actually Bison is the correct North American term.
Yep. They're not
buffalo is a European word.
Yeah, they're not buffalo.
Yeah, exactly. So lo and behold, here's this water buffalo head hanging in. Yeah, I'm not sure where that is. But November 10th, they finally agree and submit this version. And the 23rd of December, it finally gets approved. And, then again, Patterson's writing not emails, memos. No emails in 43.
Nope.
And he's saying, when can this get approved? When can this get approved? And of course, Heaton says, well, this is going to take a while. RCAF headquarters has to approve it. It has to go back to Canada. The Governor General has to approve it. Then it has to come back here. And this is when he asks, well, can we call it, they agree on being called, the Bisons, right? And they're still known today. 429 Squadron is active in Trenton, and they're known as the Bisons, right? They even have a bison painted on the tail of their aircraft.
Yep.
Okay. So what he does is he goes flying around trying to figure out how to get a Bison head. and turns out, wow, the CPR,
of course,
in England, the European manager, a fellow named Clues, he somehow finds him and says, hey, do you guys have any Bison heads that we could use? or that you could donate to the squadron. And they go, yeah, as a matter of fact, we have 3, you want to come down to London, take a look and pick out which one you want. And Pattison had designated Del Kenny to go down and have a look, but something happened. They weren't able to do it. And Pattison eventually says, pick out the one you feel most appropriate and bring that one with you, is what they end up doing. And so, of course, they have a parade on 7 January of 44, and they form the squadron up, pull out a heli and a little flatbed truck, and Clues is there, the station commander is there, and, of course, Pattison's there. And they unveil this bison head, which actually came from some bisons in Wainwright, Alberta. Yay.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Wainwright is just down the road, a couple hours from Edmonton here.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I spent 10 years in the reserves, and we spent a lot of time training in Wainwright.
I'm sure you did.
Yeah, a lot. So, they took pictures of it, and all that sort of stuff. Now, the interesting thing is when the squadron's disbanded in May of 46, everything gets packed up and shipped off, God knows where.
Yep.
Well, in 1999, when I was invited to the squadron to speak about, what I had learned about the squadron history, Colonel McCremon at the time, the first female CO of an Air Force squadron, a Royal Canadian Air Force squadron, decided to see if they could find the bison head. And lo and behold, they found it at the National Archives. And it's sitting in a crate. And they said, hey, can we have it back? And eventually they did get it back. And a few years ago, I was in Trenton, and they have it sitting there up in their headquarters office area. But, the first thing I noticed when I looked at it, I go, it shrank. I go, it wasn't that small. Because when you look at the pictures of it when it was presented, I think it's about twice the size.
It looks big, yeah.
Yeah, it looks quite big. But the horns look the same. That's the one thing. So it no doubt is the original bison. And now it rightfully hangs in 429 Squadron's headquarters office for all to see. And they actually have a picture of when it was presented. And actually, Clues from the CPR said, you must always, when you display the bison, it must always be said that it was donated by the CPR.
Okay.
And then after that, Pattison, again, sent a flurry of memos trying to get the CPR to adopt 429 Squadron.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So, because, at the time they were sharing space with 427 Lion Squadron at Leaming, and 427 was adopted by MGM Studios.
Yes.
And, a bunch of movie stars used to come and visit 427 Squadron.
Yeah.
And apparently they also had movie passes that would get them into any MGM theater in England for free.
Yep.
As well. So, Pattison was trying to find perks for his own squadron. He thought CPR, maybe get free train rides. I don't know what the logic was. But eventually the CPR said, no, it wouldn't be appropriate because they have so many members of the CPR that were overseas fighting, something like in the neighborhood of 12,000.
Yeah, it's not that surprising. Yeah.
Yeah. And they said, we would rather be helping and supporting those families, the families of those people overseas fighting, than to give all our help to one specific squadron. Very political answer, a polite way of saying no.
Pretty much.
Right?
Yep.
And so it gives up, and we were eventually adopted by the city of Lethbridge in the summer of 44 instead. And Lethbridge is in Alberta.
Yes, it is.
Southern Alberta, of course. Now, Here's an interesting photo. It was taken around Christmas time of 44. And in it, you can see over here, we have Higgins. He's still on the squadron as the adjutant. And he's handing out cigarette rations, okay, to all the guys on the squadron. Now, the caption makes no mention of the fact that sitting right here is the approved new crest of the squadron signed by King George. No mention whatsoever. And one thing the squadron also did was, by fluke, the company that had, put together the Bison and everything else and had the cast of it and did a drawing for them, they had done a cast of the Bison and put it together in a plaque and sent it to the squadron as well, because the squadron was having these buttons made up. And they used the cast to make the buttons. And then they took the cast and put a frame around it and said, here's this frame. And it's made out of bronze, and apparently it's quite heavy. I've never actually seen one, but a lot of vets have them. And it probably weighs about 10 pounds. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's about this big, 4 inches round. But you can see here on Higgins, right there, there's a little something on his pocket. And I blew it up. And what it is, it's the badge for the Bison. So again, establishing themselves as the Bison Squadron. The first round of badges they ordered were blue, and the next 2 orders after that were black. And I actually have a blue one. So,
cool. That's awesome.
Yeah. But, there's no mention of this in the photo caption whatsoever about the new crest there or what it means.
Yeah, that's not surprising, to be honest.
Yeah. And finally, and then, of course, it gets approved. And what happens is group says, well, we want to present this, but you guys have to get it framed. And then we'll come down and we'll hand it back to you and say, here's your official crest.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't happen. The squadron doesn't get presented with their official crest until 5 April of 45. So we're starting in January of 43.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And finally, and this is Wing Commander Baldock, who's receiving the crest at the time. Now, it's really interesting. There were 2 different dates in the ORB of when the crest got presented. In the leaning ORB, it said April 10th. And in the ORB of the squadron, it said April 5th. And this photo is actually dated April 5th. So we have to go with the assumption the parade was on April 5th of 45.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's another one of those same things.
Yeah, exactly. Now, one of the big things about the squadron or any Air Force squadron was the ground crew. The ground crew rarely gets mentioned. They're not even, their names aren't even in the ORB being posted in or posted out or anything like that. And 2 ground crew members were very significant in helping me with my research. The first one here on the left, Jim Rowlandson. He was, again, he ended up as ground crew. He was unfit medically to be air crew. He collected a lot of information about the squadron, and post-war, he interviewed a lot of the veterans with the idea he was going to write a book.
Okay.
And when I first met him, he was very open and showed me all his information. And when he was on his deathbed, his son sent me all the documentation Jim had collected over the years and said, here, because I mentioned I'd be writing a book, and he sent all his information to me to use for the book. So I dedicated my book actually to Jim Rowlandson.
Oh, wow.
And, it's really interesting. On all his sheets of paper, he would write a little note here or there, and that would send me on a trail to find out some very, very interesting information about the squadron that no one would have known unless you were there.
Yeah.
So, yep. And another fellow who was on the squadron, standing here is Don Ross. He was in charge of L Lift for Love, right from the Wellington period all the way to the end of the war. He started out as narrow engine guy and eventually became the crew chief. He had tons of photos of the squadron, especially during the Wellington period. He must have had a camera in his hand the whole time.
Oh, probably.
And taking photos. And these two guys were extremely helpful in getting me all kinds of information. As a matter of fact, two of these photos are from Don Ross's collection. And unfortunately, he didn't record the names of the crew, the ground crew members here. Like here, the NAFTY truck pulls up and everyone's taking a break for tea or hot chocolate and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And of course, whenever it snows, someone's got to clean the snow off the wings of the aircraft.
Yep.
And these guys worked outside the vast majority of times. Don said the only time they really got to work in the hangar is if they were changing out an engine.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they were outside freezing. As you can see, these three guys here working on the engine of the aircraft, and they're in the great outdoors. Now, over here on the bottom left is a picture of LV 993, the Halifax with the most number of sorties in 6th Group, and probably Bomber Command.
There we go.
Yeah, and this is actually part of the crew that took care of it. Now, on the extreme left here is Jim Rowlandson's brother, who also served on the squadron as ground crew. Flight Lieutenant Brown is the guy in the middle. He was the one who finished up the last sorties of LV 993. And right here is Sergeant Smith, who is the crew chief for LV 993. And let me give you a close-up shot of the nose here. Here's Brown again. Now, up here, you can see they have a DFC painted and an MID. Now, Smith actually earned an MID on the squadron for all his work he did as a crew chief, and they actually painted that on the nose of the aircraft as part of the artwork. Yeah. And when I did my book launch at the Net and Air Museum, they had 2 nose arts recreated on panels from actual Halifaxes that they've put up on display at in the museum, and LV 993's nose art is one of them, and hence this T-shirt, which you can order online from the Bomber Command Museum in Netton. In case you'd like one, it's 429 Squadron, which is
there you go.
Better.
I just want to jump in with a quick question here. When did the squadron get the Mark III Halleys and get rid of the 2s and 5s?
Oh, you're going to ask me a tough question. It was kind of a phased thing.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, because the Mark IIs were the ones they used first, and then the Mark Vs came in, and then the Mark IIIs. So if I had to look at it, just let me check the authoritative history.
It's lucky you got that book from somewhere.
Yeah, it sure is handy. Let's see, the Mark IIs. Let's see. The first Mark Vs appeared on the squadron in November of 43.
Okay.
They converted to Halleys in mid-August of 43. That was the Mark IIs. And then the first Mark III actually arrived on the squadron in February of 44.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah.
But the first one arrived in February, but more of them trickled in a lot later.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, it was never done, in one blow.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm sure Carl over at the Bomber Command Museum will be very happy I mentioned LV 993. He's a big heli guru. He did a presentation on this the same day as my book launch. Now, I want to talk about something that I found going through the ORB, and it was actually typed in. It was called the Battle of the Push Broom. And it was a war that raged in 429 Squadron from about July 1st of 44 to July 14th of 44. And, at first I was like, what's this? And you started reading and it was so hilarious when you think about it, and the fact some clerk took the time to type it out, because, they're typing this stuff up at the end of the day and they're finally off duty when it's done, right? And he takes his time to type it out. And it involved, at the time, the bomb leader of the squadron, who was Ian McIntosh, in the equipment section. Now, he had been posted into the squadron on Rawson's crew in December 10th of 42. And they actually survived through the whole Wellington period. Wow. But they only completed 26 ops during that time. And most of the crew ended up doing, in this case, Mac did 4 ops on helis. 2 to complete his tour, and then he did 2 later on in like December of 43 and November of 44. I don't know, to go along for a ride, see what it was like again, that sort of thing. Hard to say. So what happened was, somewhere on July 5th, the first entry occurs in the ORB that said a few days earlier, the bomb section was, cleaning up their area, and they noticed they didn't have a push broom. And for some reason, it was missing. So Mac says to them, well, no problem. Go down to the equipment section, supply, and get a push broom. So the clerk behind the counter says, sorry, you can't have a push broom. You got to fill in paperwork. First, you got to fill in the paperwork why you lost your first one. And another one saying you'd like a new one.
Yep.
And in July 5th, it says, Flight Lieutenant McIntosh has been working diligently for the past several days to fill out the paperwork to get this done. So that's why we figure it probably started somewhere around 1 or 2 or 3 July, right? So he's filling in the paperwork to try and get a push broom. Now go figure, this is wartime, right?
Oh, yeah.
And when I was in the Army, we had this saying about the guys in QM, quartermaster, where you got all your stuff, that their motto was, we have it, you ain't getting it. Okay, so this seems to be what they're doing here. So again, he's on the 5th of July, the entry, he says he's been laboring for several days to fill out the form, and to no avail. They refuse it. And Mac announces that diplomatic relations are strained, and he recalls his ambassador from equipment. July 6th, Mac states his diplomatic staff have returned from equipment without a broom, and negotiations have completely broken off, right? And then July 7th, Mac pleads a final plea for understanding from the equipment section. Please, we need a broom. And then still no luck, and July 8th, the equipment section says, forget it, you ain't getting a broom. So Max consults with his deputy bomb leader, and they declare war on the equipment section. They want a damn broom. And, finally, on July 14th, it says the Battle of the Push Broom, which has been raging between the section, the equipment section, has at last been suspended, and peace again reigns supreme. However, the bombing leader was not able to obtain his broom. It was compelled to accept an old one from one of the other more fortunate sections who had 2. What do you want to bet? They stole the one from the bombing section.
Probably.
Yeah. And it says the only casualty in this war was the wounded pride of Flight Lieutenant McIntosh. And I'll tell you, you're reading through the ops, and this guy FDR'd, and this happened, and that happened, and then this.
Yep.
just in the, and this is during, essentially the Battle of Normandy, right?
Yep.
And they're flying a lot of ops during this time.
Yeah, a lot.
The most ops they flew was in July or August of 44.
Probably July.
Yeah, both those months was incredible. Some days they flew 2 ops in one day.
Yeah, sorry, probably August because of all the operations on the ground.
Yeah, and they got time to do this.
Oh
right?
yeah, I mean, just jump in real quick because we're just getting later. But I've seen this. Like, this is amazing. This is why I didn't want to ask you about this before, because I'm like, I think I know what this is going to be about, but I just wanted to hear it kind of live with everybody else. But you see these things because what they're dealing with, right? It's so brutal, and like it's been mentioned by the sidebar and yourself, the casualties in Bomber Command are huge, and you got to do something to kind of have some levity and some humor sometimes. And
McIntosh is probably the longest serving member of the squadron during wartime. Wow. He was there from 10 December 42, and then he was posted out in 4 November of 44.
Yeah.
And it's funny, he's mentioned numerous times, and then on October 11th, there's an entry, October 11th of 44. They're having a victory bond drive, and Mac figures that he's quite the pool player, so he says, anyone can challenge me to a game of pool, and the loser has to buy a bond. Okay? Well, after 3 games of pool, Mac lost all 3 games, and he was the one having to buy the bond. He suspended the pool tournament for raising victory bonds because he thought he could beat everyone, and he wouldn't have to buy any bonds, and the loser would. Turns out he ended up being the loser every time. So,
well, yeah.
So quite a character.
Yeah,
quite a character. And I guess how are we doing for time?
We got a little bit more.
Okay, just let me know when to stop.
Yeah, I want to keep it around an hour and a half if we can.
Yeah, okay. Now, on 10 July, the WDEBs come to visit the squadron. Now, the WDEBs are the Royal Canadian Air Force entertainment troupe of women. And one of the guys at the time, Sergeant Puskas, wrote that they were all real cuties and they had talent. So this is 1944, remember, okay? Yeah. So people looked at things differently. Now, so what we have is some pictures of them. They went on a tour of the station. Mm-hmm. And of course, 429 was in all their glory here. In the middle, we have, over here, we have Wing Commander Al Avant, who's the CO at the time. He's 21 years old. Okay.
Yeah.
And we have Arbuckle, one of the flight commanders. And we have here Sergeant Harry Glass, a Canadian flight engineer.
Right.
Okay. And then over here we have Flight Lieutenant Hall. And they're on Halifax H for How. And this is where they're taking all the pictures here, and you can see them with the ground crew over here, and they're all, the Debs are checking it out, and they actually recorded the name of the ground crew in this photo, which was quite surprising.
Sure.
And what they end up doing is they take Hall's aircraft, LW-132 H for How, and they rename it the WDEBs and have the WDEBs names painted on the nose of the aircraft. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing here is Harry Glass is the flight engineer of this crew. Harry Glass was an aero engine mechanic, and then he decided to fly ops. And another interesting thing is he's Jewish, which is like, if you get shot down in enemy territory and you're Jewish, what's going to happen to you, at the time. Mm-hmm. Now, he became a flight engineer, started flying ops, and didn't tell his family back home. Okay.
Okay.
Now, on the Nuremberg trip, on 31 November 44.
Yeah.
The only Halifax we lose is the one Harry Glass is in. And, their aircraft ditches in the channel. And the only person lost is the pilot. And I forgot his name right offhand, but that's the pilot there on the right.
Mm.
And Harry Glass ends up being awarded a DFM because he did a lot to get all the crews in a dinghy and were safe. The pilot didn't make it out. I think his name was Wilton. Sorry, for some reason I didn't put his name here to remind me. I do apologize for that. Okay, so he's rescued, and then Harry Glass is put in Flight Lieutenant Hall's crew as the flight engineer. Okay, so now we have this aircraft. H for Howe is now called the WDEB instead. So on the 8th of August, the crew is going on a bombing op to Chantilly. Daylight op. They're at 15,000 feet. Suddenly, a fire breaks out in one of the starboard outer engine, I believe. Hall says to everyone, get your parachutes on. We might have to bail out. So the aircraft is going down. And at 5,000 feet, it goes into this spin and then blows up. Now, Harry Glass, along with the rest of the crew, except for Sergeant Harrod, who's the navigator, are all killed in this unfortunate accident. And the whole squadron sees it, that are flying, to the op, because it's daylight, broad daylight. And as a matter of fact, an air-sea rescue launch that was on the south coast of England actually saw them started going on fire and launched to go out there and try and get to the aircraft as quick as possible. The aircraft goes down, blows up. Harrod is blown through the front nose of the aircraft, through the Perpex glass.
Wow.
His face is basically crushed, scarred up beyond all recognition. He's the only survivor pulled out of the water. All two of the bodies were not recovered. Hall and Murray, I believe it was. The rest were. But, 2 months, a month earlier, they were showing the WDEBs their aircraft and renaming it for them, and boom, they're gone. Unfortunately, but that's what happens in war, right?
Yep.
August 11th, 45, the King comes to visit Leeming Station. And he visits 427 and 429. And this is him touring 429's lines. This is King George here with his back turned. The lady civilian here is his wife, Queen Elizabeth. And right behind her is Princess Elizabeth, future Queen Elizabeth II. And, of course, they have a parade, do an inspection. Now, the interesting thing with the photos at this time, you can see all kinds of people standing on the roofs of hangars and other buildings all around the parade when it's taken at different angles. But you can see that, so they're right here, a whole bunch of them here as King George is walking through and inspecting the troops. And, of course, he hands out a whole bunch of decorations. On the 429 side, we've got 2, 4, 6, 8. Should be one more. 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 decorations that are handed out. It must have been a long parade because 427 also had decorations handed out. And you'll also notice here, McIntosh got awarded his DFC, so he got to meet the King. And it's interesting, Richie, who was awarded a DFM, him and Mangione and Steer were together in an op, and they ended up flying the plane back to England after the pilot was killed, Anderson.
Oh, right.
And they were all, given decorations. And
Yep.
And Richie said, well, we were given brand new uniforms on that day, and nice ones, he said. And I go, so what did the king say to you when he gave you his medal? He goes, I can't remember. He goes, I was scared so shitless, I didn't want to be there.
Yeah.
And that's so funny, because here he is flying these ops over occupied territory.
Yep.
And he was more afraid of one-on-one with King George VI than enemy flak and fighters, right?
Yep.
Now, one of the guys here that is getting a decoration, Wing Commander French. This is a photo of him on that day. And at that time, Wing Commander French is the CEO of 428 Squadron, but he was on 429 Squadron for 10 ops, and he was a flight commander, before he was posted to 428 as the CEO. And then for any people that have been to CFS Alert, which isn't very many, there was a Lank that crashed on the 31st of July, 1950, and all 10 members on the plane were killed, and the pilot was Wing Commander French. And they're all buried up there. So, but how are we doing? Are we done? Are we over yet? We got to, okay, one more slide. Our most famous ditching. The Kingsland crew, they were on a gardening op to Oslo. They went in. It's interesting when you talk to these guys about gardening ops, and they said they were sitting ducks, because you had to measure yourself from a land point at the right angle, degrees, flying time, airspeed, timed, and then you drop your mines. Yep. And of course, first guy goes in, he gets all shot up and beat up, and then the next guys are like, no, I don't want to fly in that, right? So Kingsland's crew went in. They got shot up pretty bad. Their starboard engine caught on fire. They still managed to drop their mines in the right spot, and they were flying away, and then they're steadily losing height, and then a prop flies off the inner starboard engine, or on the outer starboard, flies into the inner starboard, and now they're only flying on 2 engines on the port side. And Kingsland is trying to control the plane. He's got both feet on the dash, and but the plane is in this slow turn. 40-minute turn, it was described as, and they're slowly going down. And it's like, it's midnight. And who wants to ditch in the North Sea at midnight, right?
Not me.
And eventually they have to ditch. Yeah. So they go down. Kingsland kind of got knocked knocked against the dash in the steering column, and he had to get pulled out. Everyone got into the dinghy, and of course they cut away the rope of the dinghy, and the plane starts to sink, and they're starting to get pulled down with the plane, and they're like, oh my God, we cut the wrong rope. They cut the rope to the supply dinghy with all their supplies in it, right?
Yeah.
So right away they had to cut the rope that they had, so they wouldn't go down with the plane. And so they're sitting there, and Kingsland actually had, on the control panel of the aircraft, he always had his hat, and it had a Royal Flying Corps badge on it, because his father was in the Royal Flying Corps in World War I as a pilot. Right. And, he started to panic, to say, my hat, my hat, my hat. And one of the crew members said, well, the plane's only been down for a couple of minutes. Maybe you can dive down there and still get it, right?
Oh,
it's like, we're in the middle of the North Sea.
Yeah.
We have no provisions, and all you care about is this hat, right?
Yeah. Again, not the first time I've heard something like that.
Yeah. So, of course, they Courtois, the wireless operator, this whole time had been transmitting in Morse code here's our position. Here's where we're located. Come get us. We're ditching, right?
Yeah.
And in the end, Kingsland and Courtois are both awarded DFCs for their action in this op. A launch goes out from an air-sea rescue launch goes out from Scotland to go and find them. And he eventually picks them up like at 5 o'clock in the morning because 429 Squadron sent out a bunch of planes to do air rescue to try and locate the Kingsland crew.
Yeah.
And one of the crews did find them, started circling over them, dropped them provisions. And the second crew started flying towards Scotland to find the air rescue launch so they could guide them to Kingsland.
Mm.
So the air rescue launch finds them, picks them up, starts taking them back to Scotland, and guess what happens? It runs out of fuel.
Oh, jeez.
Because it was way beyond the range that they should have been going.
Yep.
So, of course, now the air rescue launch is stranded and they have to radio and say, hey, come get us. And eventually they're rescued. But in total, the Kingsland's crew spent something like 13 or 15 hours in a dinghy. Now, at the time they were rescued, it was the only time an entire crew had been out that long and all survived.
Yeah. Yeah.
And especially in 6th Group, if not Bomber Command. And apparently they became really famous for it. They had their pictures taken for the Maple Leaf newspaper, and Kingsland went on tours of all the squadrons in 6th Group about here's how you survive a ditching. Because apparently he drilled the crew relentlessly on ditching exercises, right? And how to get out. And it paid off.
Yeah, obviously.
And what was it? A week later, they were back flying ops again.
Yep.
Yeah. And eventually finished their tour. They didn't say, okay, you've had enough. We'll take you off ops. They made them finish a full tour, and then they took them off ops.
Yeah.
But apparently, at the time, very famous all through 6th Group and Bomber Command because of the fact they were out there so long. It was somewhere between 13 and 15 hours, and they all survived.
Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, sorry, just jump in. If anyone has any questions, throw them in the chat now, if that's all right. Do you got one more quick story for us?
Do I have one more? Let's see what we got on the slides. Oh, here's one for you. 9th of May, 45. The Premier of Saskatchewan came to visit the squadron, Tommy Douglas. So, he's out there schmoozing with the guys. One of the people he talked with on the left here, top left, squadron leader Douglas, his namesake, two guys with the last name of Douglas.
Yeah.
Squadron leader Douglas had been posted into the squadron on the 23rd of March, 45. Bottom left, he talks with Flying Officer Saunders, who is from the same town as Tommy Douglas, Weyburn, Saskatchewan.
Weyburn, yeah.
Yeah, and so, Saunders had been posted in on the 31st of December. And then over on the right there, he's got a picture taken with Moffat and Humphreys, and they had been posted in December of 44. And also, Flying Officer Campbell, who had been posted in October of 44. And, Tommy Douglas, when he came on the station, he also went to 427, but 427 can write their own history and talk. Okay, I'm doing 429. And the big thing Tommy Douglas wanted to do was meet all the boys from Saskatchewan.
Yeah,
is what he said the minute he got on the squadron. Where are the boys from Saskatchewan? And so everyone, Tommy Douglas, of course, the father of universal healthcare. Shirley Douglas's daughter marries what's his name, Sutherland.
Yeah, Donald Sutherland.
And they have their son is Kiefer Sutherland, of course, and Donald Sutherland, of course, a big actor in a lot of movies, including Kelly's Heroes and MASH. And Kiefer Sutherland, well, we know about him. He did the series 24 and everything else. And, his father was, his grandfather was Tommy Douglas.
Yep.
So.
All right. Well, I don't think we have any questions, but there was one I did want to save to the end from Shell Drake, Dave Patterson. Yeah, it's all right. I'm just going to get rid of the PowerPoint here.
Sure, no problem.
Because I know you've talked about this on the other show. So if you want to talk about this for a minute, just because I think it's important, just let me do a little preface here. I think it's important to talk about this because you said you had some trouble from the squadron initially and didn't kind of get the support you were hoping for.
Okay.
If you don't want to talk about it, you don't have to talk about it.
Well, here's what happened originally. This is one reason that motivated me to collect all this information about the squadron. See, I had served in 2 infantry regiments, and each of those regiments knew their history,
right?
Their World War I history, their World War II history. Both had published war diaries. They had their rolls of honor. You could always see them. They both had museums with all their information. And you could go in the CO's office and he had pictures of all the commanding officers from the inception of the regiment to present day, right? They were all there. And of course the battle honors, on the regimental colors. And of course 429 has their, standard with their battle honors on it as well. And see, so when I first called the squadron, it was about 98, 99, and I got a hold of the person who was a squadron historical officer,
right?
A secondary duty, right? And so I finally got a hold of him and said, "Hi, I'm trying to find out what happened to my uncle. I was wondering, do you have any information about your World War II history?" And he says, "Well, not much." And I go, "Well, do you have a roll of honor of everyone killed in World War II?" He says, "Well, no, we don't." And that personally bothered me because my uncle had been killed on the squadron, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, why don't you have a roll of honor?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, one thing to keep in mind, people were being posted in and out of 429 squadron during the war like crazy.
Yeah.
Guys were in there for weeks and going out, doing 2 ops, 5 ops, 10 ops, getting posted somewhere else, right? So there was constant movement, and it wasn't many people that hung around for a long time. Like Higgins, the adjutant, did, and he managed to carry through and get the squadron crest approved after Patterson left the squadron when he got injured by an incendiary bomb blowing up in November of 44, right?
Yeah.
So it was Higgy that carried the ball on that, right?
Right.
So again, same thing here. At the end of the war, they started posting guys home, posting other people in. 429 squadron stayed on until end of May 46 as part of the occupational force.
Yep.
And again, these were guys flying in, flying out, right? Not a lot of continuity, right? So do they have a roll of honor? No. I said, do you have a list of ops the squadron flew during the war? No, we don't. I go, do you have a list of all the COs and a picture of the COs? And he goes, well, no, we don't. He goes, we don't have much about World War II. And I go, well, do you have a list of all the awards and decorations that were handed out at the squadron? No. Do you have any information about your battle honors and why they were awarded? He goes, well, no, we don't. And I go, so what do you have of your World War II history? And he says, well, not much. And I said, it sounds like you have nothing at all. And I slammed the phone down. I was so infuriated. I was young back then, right? Yeah. This is like 1999. I'm 38 then, I guess, 37. And I'm going, how can this squadron not know its World War II history?
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, I was in 2 infantry regiments. They knew theirs. Every single infantry regiment across the country knows their history.
Yeah.
And they have it documented. And I go, oh, man. So I thought I got to start looking for this information, and I started putting it up on my website at 429sqn.ca. And then the next thing you know, I'm getting email inquiries from all around the world. Well, I had a relative killed on 429. I had a relative served on 429. What can you tell me? Because none of them knew, right?
Yep.
So I eventually, because of the ORB and Chorley's book on Bomber Command losses, the first thing I constructed was, the Roll of Honor. And in 99, when I went to do a presentation, I actually put one together and, had it framed and gave it to Colonel McCrimmon. And they kept it with the regiment, their squadron standard or squadron colors. And then the squadron got disbanded a few years later.
Yep.
Boom. Everything gets packed up, gone. Then the squadron gets reformed, right? And, the squadron warrant officer told me one of his projects is he wants to create a Roll of Honor before he retires out. And I go, I gave the squadron a Roll of Honor in 99. So I don't know where it went, but, good on you for taking on that project, because if the squadron doesn't remember them, who will?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, fortunately, there's this book now, which is available as print on demand, which apparently can be available 100 years from now if Amazon is still around.
If they're still around. Yeah. It's linked down below if anyone's interested. So you can check that out.
So I figure this isn't all inclusive. There's a lot of things I didn't put in here because, it was thick enough. And like I said to Ted Barris when the editor said, can we take some stuff out? I go, what? What? I go, this is like the bare minimum.
You were saying earlier that you don't have any. Would you say you don't have the credentials or anything? I'm like, that sounds like a historian to me.
Well, no, I'm not a trained historian.
That sounds like a historian to me.
My grade 12 history teacher, I said I want to be a historian. When I graduated from high school, he said, "Don't bother. You're at the tail end of the baby boom. There's no jobs as a historian. Find a real job." And here I am. I end up writing this book by default. It was a broken promise I made to a bunch of veterans. You can read about that in the preface of the book, how it actually ended up. I ended up writing this book. But, eventually you have all this information and you go, my God, all these people I talked to, they're all dead.
Mm-hmm.
And who's going to remember the sacrifice they made? Because, when they signed up into the Royal Canadian Air Force, they signed up for the duration.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't know how long that was going to be.
Yeah, exactly.
And some of these guys on the squadron joined in 39.
Yep.
So, yeah. So hopefully, at least the information's there now.
Yep.
Do I want to do any more work on it? No. I'd like to have a break. But, funny thing, I get sucked in almost every day doing something or some inquiry about 429 Squadron. And I do the best I can to help people because I was in the exact same situation.
Yeah.
I wanted to find out what happened to my uncle.
Well, right? Just generally say thank you for that. Because again, I know these things and what's available, what's not, what's missing, what's hidden, what's possibly out there. So you taking this on is amazing. And that's kind of why I asked that at the end, because I wanted to come full circle. Because, you wanted to find information and now you're helping other people get this information, which to me is
right.
Obviously, I'm a biased historian, but that's great. So thanks, Greg, for doing that. And I'm sure that people appreciate that you're doing this. And
well, I don't want to brag or anything, but, quite honestly, I got to say this is probably the most comprehensive squadron history ever written.
Probably.
About any squadron anywhere.
Yeah, I don't know anything like that. And I mean that in a good way. I mean, yeah, people are loving the presentation. So thanks.
Okay.
Does the Squadron HQ have a copy?
Does what?
Does the squadron?
At the book launch, 2 members of the squadron came down, the squadron warrant officer, the head of tactical operations, and they bought a total of 4 books, and one for the Squadron CO. Absolutely. They're supposed to be having a soiree in April timeframe for the 80th anniversary of the Squadron, which was, in last year actually, but they didn't have one because they were so busy with flying ops and doing all kinds of other things. So they plan on having one, and I might be invited down.
Oh, hopefully.
Don't know yet, but I've had the warning order that we may be doing this, and we'd like you to come down.
Oh, that'd be great.
So that would be fun.
Seems like the minimal they can do, but yeah. So thanks again, Greg, for coming on. I appreciate it. Again, with the delay, we were supposed to have you on way back in last year, but it was great to finally get this on and get to talk about this. And it's great to get these stories and all that. And yeah, so hopefully people will check out the book and see all the great work you've done.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And thanks for having me on. I'm following in the footsteps of guys like Ted Barris and David O'Keefe, people I really respect, and I've read their books and talked to them a lot. And the fact here I am, doing the same thing as them, I don't know if it elevates me or, or what.
Yeah. All right. So I'm just going to do a quick sign off, and then we'll say goodbye together. Okay.
Okay.
So thanks everyone for coming out for another OTD live stream. Hope you enjoyed this one. Again, Greg was great and obviously knows this stuff from all this work he's done. So again, check out the book at the links down below. If you do buy through those, it does help me out. Just a little commission to help the channel going. Also with that, had a new channel member sign up today. So thanks again for that. I appreciate it. And if you do want to help out the channel just a little bit each month, a couple bucks, you can do it through Patreon or through YouTube itself. So if you'd like to kind of help me keep doing this stuff and getting these Canadian stories out there to the biggest audience that I can reach, it's really, really appreciated. So thanks again. Check out all the stuff in the links below. And I'm not sure what's going to come next. Again, as a lot of you know, this has been start of 2023 has been busy as an understatement, I think, for me. So I'm hoping to get some clarity on some things soon, and then maybe we can get some more live streams get planned and get some more stuff out there. So just stay tuned for some more details about that. Hopefully soon, I think, because we're getting into March. I'm hoping to have a clearer picture of everything going on. So thanks again, Greg. Did you enjoy coming on the channel? Sounds like he sounds like he did.
Oh, absolutely. Had a great time,
Perfect.
And thanks for the opportunity. And I want to thank you, like I did earlier, for your work that you've done for the Canadians that were in Hong Kong.
Oh, thank you.
I had an uncle on my mother's side, John Marischuk. He was in the Winnipeg Grenadiers at Hong Kong, spent over 4 years as a POW of the Japanese as well, and went through all the stuff you talked about.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Oh no, it's honestly at this point it's the minimum I think I can do for them. So just telling their story means a great deal to me. So yeah. So again, thanks, Greg, and again, everyone stay tuned for some more details about what's coming up. But everyone have a rest just your evening, and for those watching the UK, go to bed. It's very late. All right, I'll see everybody next time.
Bye.